Have you ever heard of the Nephilim? These mysterious figures mentioned in the Bible have always sparked curiosity. But when we dive into the story of Goliath and his brothers, things start to take on a whole new meaning. So what do these giants really symbolize? Were they just powerful beings? Or did they represent something much deeper about the challenges we face in life? If you think you know this story, get ready for a fresh perspective that's bound to surprise you. Today, we're not just looking at physical battles, we're diving into lessons of leadership, faith, and courage that this tale brings into our reality. Picture this, a young shepherd armed with nothing but a sling and 5 stones standing face to face with a colossal warrior. Sounds like your classic underdog story, right? But it's way more than that. It's an invitation to rethink how we face our own giants, whether they're internal struggles or external challenges. The truth is, this story isn't just about David's victory. It's about how God uses the unlikely to create extraordinary change. And you know what's even better? The lessons from this narrative can be applied directly to your life today. Intrigued? Let's dive into this mystery together and discover how to conquer our giants. So, who exactly was Goliath? Picture a man so tall that standing in the middle of an army, he looked like an imposing bronze tower. Goliath wasn't just a soldier, he was a living, breathing symbol of fear. Standing over 9 feet tall, about 2.7 meters, he wore armor that weighed as much as a grown man, and his spear had an iron tip heavier than any weapon the Israelites could wield. But you know what's even more fascinating? Goliath wasn't just brute force. His daily challenge to the Israelite army was as much about psychology as it was about physical combat. Who would dare to face him? Now imagine the scene, a silent battlefield, the sun gleaming off Goliath's helmet as he roared insults and challenges. His words were as cutting as his sword. That's the kind of enemy God's people were up against. But the Bible makes one thing clear. Beneath that intimidating armor was a man who relied solely on his strength, while the Israelite army trembled in their lack of faith. And here's the thing. That's a lesson for all of us. How many times do we face seemingly insurmountable challenges and feel so small? Looking at Goliath, we see more than just a man. We see a symbol of the obstacles we face in life. He represents those problems that seem impossible to overcome, crushing debts, broken relationships, or even doubts about our faith. And isn't it interesting how these giants often seem invincible? But here's the twist. No matter how massive the challenge, it has limits. God, on the other hand, doesn't. And when it comes to Goliath's story, does it reveal something deeper? Absolutely. In the Bible, giants weren't all that rare. Goliath came from a peculiar lineage, likely tied to the ancient Nephilim, those mysterious beings who have intrigued scholars and casual readers of Scripture alike. If you've ever been curious about these enigmatic figures, know this. Goliath's story is just the tip of the iceberg. For all his presence as a fearsome warrior, Goliath also embodies human ego. His confidence was entirely rooted in his strength and weapons. Funny how that still resonates today, isn't it? How often do we place all our trust in material resources or personal abilities, forgetting there's something far greater? And this is where faith in God shifts the entire narrative. But we'll dive into that a little later. Speaking of Goliath, we can't ignore the effect he had on those around him. He didn't need to fight every day. The fear he instilled did half the work for him. That's something many of us can relate to. Sometimes the biggest battle isn't what's happening around us, but what's happening in our own minds. If you've ever had days when anxiety felt like a towering giant, then you have a glimpse of what the Israelite army felt hearing Goliath's taunts. But if Goliath is fascinating, what about the one who dared to face him? That brings us to an unexpected figure, someone who, at first glance, seemed like the least likely to make history. Get ready to talk about faith, courage, and an unforgettable lesson in the next part of this story. Picture this, a young boy, no military training, stepping up to face the fiercest warrior Israel had ever feared. That was David. While Goliath put his trust in his size and weapons, David relied on something far greater, God. He wasn't a seasoned soldier, but a shepherd who knew his strength came from his faith. When he heard Goliath's insults, he didn't flinch. He knew that no matter how terrifying the giant was, God was bigger. And that's something we can all take to heart. No matter how massive the challenge, our faith can always be greater. David's courage didn't just appear out of nowhere. Think about the times he was out in the fields protecting his sheep, taking on lions and bears to keep them safe. Those seemingly smaller challenges prepared him for something much bigger. In the same way, the little battles we face every day might just be the training ground for something extraordinary that's still to come. So next time you're up against a problem that feels minor, remember, it could be God getting you ready for a bigger fight. And here's what makes David's story even more inspiring. He didn't use conventional weapons. He took what he had, a sling and 5 stones. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But that's the beauty of it. So often, we underestimate the resources we already have, thinking we need something flashy or grand to succeed. The Bible shows us that in the right hands, even the simplest tools can take down giants. So what are the stones you're holding on to but not using today? Another fascinating point is David's unwavering confidence. When he stepped onto the battlefield, Saul tried to give him his armor, but it didn't fit. That's a powerful reminder that we don't need to fight our battles using someone else's strategies or tools. God equips us uniquely, giving us exactly what we need to win. Maybe today you're trying to fit into something that just isn't for you. Trust me, you've already got what it takes to overcome. And then came the moment of truth. David faced Goliath with a faith that must have seemed outright crazy to everyone watching. With a single stone, he took the giant down. It wasn't luck, it was God working through his courage. If you think about it, that's something we see in our own lives too. When we put our trust in God, the things that seem impossible suddenly aren't. After all, who would have thought a stone could defeat a sword? What makes this story even more incredible is that David didn't stop there. He became a symbol of how faith can transform lives. Today we can look at his story and apply it to our own battles. It's not about having the best tools or the greatest odds. It's about having faith in the God who makes the impossible possible. If you've ever faced something that seemed hopeless, you know exactly what I mean. But the story of David and Goliath doesn't end with the giant's fall. In fact, it opens the door to an even more fascinating narrative. After all, Goliath wasn't the only giant, and there's so much more to uncover about this mysterious lineage. Let's dig deeper into that in the next part of this journey. When we hear about Goliath, it's natural to wonder, was he one of a kind, or were there others like him? The truth is, he was part of a mysterious and awe-inspiring lineage. The Bible mentions the Nephilim and the Rephaim, beings described as giants, not just in size but in influence. Goliath and his brothers, for example, were descendants of a generation marked by their imposing presence. But what really stands out is what these giants symbolize: recurring challenges that God's people had to face time and again. And believe it or not, they haven't completely disappeared from our lives. These physical giants also serve as a powerful metaphor for the giants we face every day. Ever felt like a problem keeps coming back, deeply rooted, refusing to go away? That's exactly how these giants operated. Even when one was defeated, another would rise, challenging the people of Israel all over again. It's a reminder that even after we conquer a big battle, new ones will always emerge. The key lies in holding on to faith and perseverance. But who were these giants really? Some theories suggest they were descendants of the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis, those mysterious beings born from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. This raises all kinds of intriguing questions about their origins and purpose. While we don't have all the details, one thing's for sure: they represent obstacles that can only be overcome with God's help. Just as Israel needed faith to face them, we need to trust that God equips us to tackle the giants in our own lives. And what about the physical traits of these giants? Goliath, for instance, was a figure of brute strength, but his brothers were also feared warriors. What's striking is how these giants always showed up during critical moments for God's people. They appear in stories that teach us about courage, strategy, and most importantly, dependence on God. These giants show us that even the toughest challenges can be conquered when we don't rely solely on our own strength, but lean on divine power. Interestingly, the presence of these giants in the Old Testament raises another fascinating question. Were they merely enemies, or did they serve a greater purpose in God's plan? Sometimes the toughest obstacles we face are there to teach us valuable lessons. For instance, life's giants can push us to grow in maturity, faith, and dependence. Have you ever considered that the difficulties you're dealing with today might actually be preparing you for something greater in the future? On top of that, the giants remind us that evil doesn't just vanish easily. It can take on new forms, just like it did across generations. But as we learn from David, the key isn't in the size of the enemy, but in the size of our faith. If Goliath and his brothers teach us anything, it's that victory is within reach for those who trust in God. And that's a source of hope we can hold on to when facing whatever comes our way. Now, if these giants were so formidable, imagine the impact David and his men had when they defeated them. These victories weren't just physical. They symbolized something much greater. And that's where the story ties into lessons that transcend generations. Let's dive into those powerful lessons of leadership and faith in the next part of this journey. David wasn't just a hero in the battle against Goliath. He became a timeless example of leadership rooted in faith and courage. Picture someone who, despite being young and inexperienced, had the guts to take on the impossible. That's not just bravery, that's vision. True leaders see beyond their circumstances and place their trust in something bigger. David didn't just defeat a giant, he inspired an entire nation to believe again. And that's a powerful takeaway. Leadership isn't about size or strength, it's about vision and trust. David's courage teaches us that great leaders don't shy away from challenges. They face them head-on, even when they're intimidating. Think about your own struggles. How many times have you backed down because the obstacles seemed too big? David shows us that true strength comes from knowing who to trust. He didn't rely on his own abilities, but on the certainty that God was with him. That's the essence of leadership, guiding others with faith, even when the path ahead looks uncertain. Another fascinating trait of David as a leader is his humility. He rejected Saul's armor because he knew it wasn't right for him. That's a reminder that authentic leaders don't try to be something they're not. They acknowledge their limitations, but trust in their strengths and, most importantly, in God. The next time you feel pressured to be something you're not, think of David. True leadership comes from staying true to who you are. And what about David's strategy? He didn't go the conventional route. While everyone expected a hand-to-hand fight, he used something simple yet effective: a sling and a stone. Wise leaders think outside the box and find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. This applies to any area of life. If you're facing a challenge today, maybe it's time to change your approach. Ask yourself, what stones do you have at your disposal that you haven't used yet? David's leadership also stands out because he didn't shy away from responsibility. He knew that by facing Goliath, he was risking not just his own life, but the fate of Israel as well. True leaders take ownership of their decisions and act with courage. If you've ever had to make a tough call, you know how daunting that can be. But as David shows us, it's in the courage to act that we find our strength. Beyond that, David teaches us that leadership is, above all, about inspiring others. His victory wasn't just personal. It restored the faith of an entire people. Great leaders leave a legacy that goes beyond their own achievements. And that makes us reflect. What kind of impact do we want to leave on the lives of those around us? Like David, we all have the chance to influence others through small acts or grand gestures. Finally, David's leadership points to something even greater. It wasn't just about his actions, but about his connection with God. He knew he wasn't fighting alone. This teaches us that no matter the challenge, we should never underestimate the power of faith. And this lesson doesn't end here. There's so much more about how David and his victories reveal God's greater plan, a journey we'll continue to explore. So now, after diving into this story packed with meaning, I have to ask, are you ready to face the giants in your life? Those challenges that feel unbeatable, whether they're in your mind, at work, or even in your faith, are really just opportunities for you to experience something greater. David's lesson is clear. With God by your side, even the smallest resource can take down the biggest enemy. And don't forget, the giant isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your victory. But here's the thing. It's not enough to just hear these lessons and not put them into action. So think about it. What's the first step you can take today to start overcoming your challenges? Maybe it's seeking more faith, stepping out in courage, or even changing the way you view the struggles you're facing. And remember this: God has already equipped you with everything you need. You just have to believe it. Now I want to hear from you. Which lesson impacted you the most? Drop a comment and share your experience. Oh, and don't leave without subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Here you'll find more content that'll transform the way you see Bible stories and help you apply them to your life. See you in the next video.